Welcome to the Time for a Reset podcast, the podcast where I, Paul Frampton, interview senior marketers on the big issues of the day and the thing that they want to see reset with an ever-changing landscape. Welcome back to another episode of Time for a Reset. I'm your host, Paul Frampton, and today I am delighted to be joined by Munnawar Chisty, who is Marketing Director and Global Category Director for Beauty at Number 7. Munnawar has led many marketing teams and has senior marketing roles at Johnson&Johnson, GSK, and most recently at Number 7. So she brings a lot of experience to this conversation, and I'm delighted to have her here. How are you, Munnawar?
Yeah, great. And I'm really pleased to join you today.
Wonderful. So we always start in the same place, Munnawar, which is if you had a big fat red button sat on the table that you could hit reset on something in our industry, what would that be?
Yeah, I'd like 2 fat red buttons, if that's all right.
You can have two.
No, let's stick with 2. Button number 1, I would love to reset on our approach as a marketing industry around DE&I. How do we get brands to be more authentically inclusive rather than doing it in a narrow way? So that's button number 1. Button number 2 is I would love to see us reset how we are transacting with consumers today as brands. So we have a very transactional relationship. How do we move that more into a one-on-one, personalised customer experience relationship? So they're my 2 red buttons.
Nice. And I'm guessing that the 2 of them kind of intersect quite nicely as well, right?
Oh, completely. I mean, nothing we do is like one thing or the other. Everything massively interacts.
And that DE&I gets a lot of coverage and it's talked a lot about within the marketing and advertising industry and in society as a whole. But I think from the conversation that we had before we started recording, we both probably don't think there's enough actual kind of progress. So could you maybe share a bit about what you believe like good DE&I practices in marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a number of things to think about when it comes to DE&I. And this is just my perspective and, from the work that we've done, and we're by no means perfect on it. So the first thing is I believe, one of the things that I've seen is DE&I is kind of like a little enabling pillar on the side. If that's how you treat DE&I, you're never going to really make the movements that you want to. Where I've seen it done best is when DE&I is central to your core strategy. Secondly, DE&I needs to be looked at from an end-to-end perspective rather than just what are we doing on our comms and do we have the right talent in our comms. And when I say end-to-end, just as some examples, I mean, so when you're starting looking at your strategy or developing product, who are you researching against? Is that cohort truly inclusive? When you're looking at your range and your range architecture, do you have a range of products that cater to all elements of society, or are you being, really narrow? Of course, the communications everybody's really aware of, but it shouldn't just be about the right talent. It should also be about, your message and your creative. Is that truly inclusive? And I've seen some great work on that recently. And then going, once further on to the end of your journey, when you look at your customer experiences, are you offering truly inclusive experiences? And then within all of that, I'd say as you're developing your work, who do you have at the table when you're having those conversations?
Yeah.
So is the group truly inclusive? Do you have the right makeup? I know when we started, for example, we didn't have as inclusive a group as we would have liked. And so we reached out to some external consultants who came in and helped us with our work. We also reached out to our internal employee resource group. We also reached out to our beauty advisors. We have 1,600 of those. And within that group, we have a really diverse number of beauty advisors. And through that collective, we were able to develop a much more holistic, authentically inclusive offering for our customers. So they're just a few of the things that I'd say from a business perspective.
No, that's great, Munnawar. And there's some really good examples there. And I love your your kind of articulation of end to end, I think, as you say, too often people think just about the advertising. And let's face it, even in advertising, we're probably not there. We're far from there yet. But your point around it going all the way through from researching and talking to a consumer about what they want and the type of products that they're interested, all the way through to the product. So the product piece must be much more challenging. Whilst people can say actually finding the right talent can be challenging, let's face it, there are many fixes to that. But a product cycle, I presume, in a business like yours is quite a long process. So how do you shift something that requires so many different kind of stakeholders to be involved and I assume takes quite a long time?
It does take quite a long time. I think it comes down to the first point I mentioned, which is about strategy. When we set our DE&I strategy, we made it central to everything we wanted to do. The other thing we did was we ensured we had the right leadership support to say that, yes, we wanted to be truly inclusive. And then you've got to look at, okay, how are you developing products today? And at the most simplest level, it's understanding gaps in the market, developing concepts, then testing those concepts, developing the formulas, testing those, etc., all the way through to the end. We had to fundamentally shift what we were doing right at the beginning. So you imagine most people will probably look at need states through a big omnibus study. You've got to look at the makeup of that omnibus study. So which markets are you doing it in? Let's say it's in the UK. Within the UK then, which consumer groups is that amongst? Is it truly inclusive? If you're only looking at a certain group, then the need states you're going to get are only going to be for that certain group. So that means the whole journey to the end is only going to be for that group. If you make it truly inclusive at the beginning, you start to identify gaps for broader targets. Now, the easiest example to talk about is foundations, where actually when you look at that, most people are struggling to get the right shade range for themselves, right? So you then take that on to then developing the products. We had a panel of customers that we were working with to develop the products. So what we were doing was testing the performance of our products amongst this group. The majority of that group, I'm just going to be really honest, were white. So if you're then testing the performance of your products against just a purely white group of consumers, what you're learning is that works really well against those, but you have no idea how it's working against black skin or South Asian skin. So we then went on a major recruitment program to increase the number of Black and South Asian customers on our database. We increased that by 18,000, which is fantastic.
Wow,
so then you start to develop and test against that group. And then you go all the way through to then the development cycle of the product and getting it out there. But if you listen to what I talked about, actually, it's the front end where we made the major changes in the development of the product, because the back end was straightforward. So that's where we made the majority of our changes. And then you mentioned, how do you do that in an organization? Yeah. I'll talk more about when I talk about customer experience, about how you do that in an organization, how you get more agile in an organization.
Yes.
In this example, we had to do we did a lot of engagement with our stakeholders around the importance of DE&I, the fact that DE&I will drive better outcomes for the business as well as for people within the business and the wider community. And there is lots of evidence that that's what will happen. We also needed to show that you needed to take a slightly different commercial lens to some of these things, because the reality is we're not going to sell as many dark shades of our foundations as we are on the lighter shades, just looking purely of the makeup of the British population. So then how you look at, profitability and rotation, all of that, you need to take a different lens, and you have to educate your teams internally around that and adjust some of your business models to work with that. And that's what we've done, and it's worked incredibly well for us. And, we became the #1 foundation brand as a result off the back of the work that we've done. So we're really proud of what we've done, but we've still got more to do.
Sure. No, I mean, the commitment that you've shown to go back and kind of grow the right sample of the right audiences, I think is great for people to hear. I think quite often people will go, have we got a diverse enough group of respondents? And they'll go, probably not. Maybe we'll try and sort it out next time. But to stop and go, we need to change this now, I think is fabulous. And you're obviously extremely passionate about this space, Munnawar, and I know you're a big supporter of kind of ethically diverse female leadership. What is the most radical thing that needs to change in the wider kind of marketing industry to get more progress? There's like you've shown that actually not only can Number 7 talk about wanting to be diverse and inclusive, but it can make it happen. But that's not easy, and a lot of people will pull away when there's a lot of work involved and a lot of challenges and difficult conversations. So in your opinion, are there one or two things that the industry can do better to actually make sure we do this stuff rather than just talk about it at conferences and on podcasts?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is education, right? And I think this podcast is fantastic because it's a way of us all listening and educating ourselves. But there are lots of ways you can go out and educate yourself. And I think the more people in the marketing industry go out and educate themselves on all facets of DE&I, because obviously race and gender is one facet, but there are many, whether that be social economic status, disability, sexual bias. I mean, there are many. The more we can educate ourselves, the more we can understand that actually, as marketeers, we're solving problems for consumers, right? Well, we will need to be solving problems for all consumers, right? For the wide range that's out there within our customer targets. So education for me is really, really important because what that drives then is an understanding of how you can then address this. The second thing that I think that needs to change, and this we are probably all still working on, is showing the commercial value of this. Now, what I can definitely talk to is as we have become more inclusive as a business, authentically inclusive as a business, we have, gained more customers. We have seen our market share grow. It has been good for business. And I think if one can help businesses understand that this is just really good for business, the two things together can work really well, education, and then people can see that this is great for business. The third thing I'd say, and it's only because I've faced a bit of this when I started as well, is sometimes it can be scary to have a conversation about DE&I.
Yeah.
And one can be worried about saying the wrong thing. One can worry that, they might upset some people. And I'd say, the more you can educate yourself, get some allyship, listen to things like this podcast, read as much as you can. It's better to engage in the conversation and try and apologize for saying the wrong thing than not have the conversation at all. Because no action is still an action, right? By not doing anything, you're still choosing to continue with what you're already doing. So they're the three things I'd say. I'd say, you'll stumble and fall. You'll get some things wrong. I certainly did. I'm sure I've said the wrong things many times. But I'm trying and we're moving forward.
No. That's great advice, Munnawar. And I like the sentiment of if you do the right thing, then it is good for business. I mean, it should follow through. Yet, quite often, I think somehow people get in their heads that if they complicate things, then that won't be right for business. And ultimately, it comes back to your point that you made right at the beginning, that if you've got a fruit salad of different customers who look and behave differently, then you have to treat them as individuals rather than treat them as one homogenous mass. I mean, that's what marketing is all about. So maybe we'll come back to your customer experience point. I know you touched on, I think you called out tails.com as an example earlier, which for those dog lovers out there, the way that they personalize food based on the individual dog and their kind of preferences, but also maybe their hair type and their diet. It's a very smart model, but one that a lot of big businesses might look at and go, how could we possibly ever replicate? They grew up in a tech-first world, and it's easy if you're just an e-commerce platform to do that. So Number 7 is obviously a business that's been around for many, many decades. How do you ensure that you keep up with the customer experience necessary for today's consumer in a business that is much more traditional than, say, tails.com?
Yeah. So first of all, you've got to instill the need for change, like the call to action, the burning platform.
Mhm.
And when you talk about tails.com, it's a brilliant example, right? Why buy a product off the shelf that can feel very transactional when you can have a very personalized experience for your dog? And by the way, the food comes with your dog's name on as well, and it
Yeah.
arrives every month, and it takes friction out of your journey. I don't need to worry about going to buy my dog food every month because it just comes in the post. We saw that in the beauty industry as well, with customers moving from very transactional relationship to a desire to have more personalization, because they were getting personalization in so many facets of their life, whether it be their dog food or their grocery deliveries that were coming in a box with recipes, or their TV subscriptions, which was giving them curated content based on their viewing habits. I mean, it was all so personalized. Why do they have to have an unpersonalized experience in beauty? And we were definitely seeing that. The challenge that we had, we'd see in the call to action, is that we are a very well-established business. Number Seven's been going for about 86 years. With that comes for governance processes that enable a large business to operate.
Yeah.
Those governance processes don't encourage agility or fundamental shifts in the business model, which is what we needed. So what we identified is we needed a fundamentally different way of operating, one that would enable us to move in an agile way, one that would enable us to experiment and fail without all the governance and business cases that you needed. And the only way to do that was to set up what we called a beauty incubator. So it's a small little agile group within our overall business. And we set that, the way I set that up with the intent of fundamentally shifting our business model. And I didn't ask the business for any resource. That was really important, because if I'd asked the business for resource, I would have had to do a business case. And actually, I didn't have the data to build that business case. So what I did is I sold a vision of new economy business models to some key people within the business and encouraged them to join this incubator with myself. I reinvested a small amount of money from my marketing pot, and I set up this little incubator. And the incubator was with the intent of delivering personalised omnichannel experiences within beauty. What we then did is we knew we didn't have the capability in-house to start developing apps or, digital experiences. So we were like, okay, we could spend millions of pounds doing this, or we could be smart and partner with startups and entrepreneurs who already have this technology. And what we bring them is branding and scale. So we approach this with a partnership mentality of how can we connect with people who have got the skill sets that we're looking for, and how can we then add value to their proposition through our brand. We then also, within our incubator, had a really light touch governance process. We just had a steerco. We met on a regular basis, and only the people on that steerco could make any decisions. And as long as we were in the test and learn phase, that's all good. And we also set a culture of it's all right to fail, because it isn't a failure, it's a learning. And we expect lots of things to go wrong, and we will adapt and pivot as we do that. And by the way, there's lots of things we did that didn't work. We didn't spend huge amounts of money on it. I'm talking about small amounts of money. Through that, actually, one last thing I forgot to mention. Let me just mention this as well. The other thing is, within this, we were really clear that we were solving problems for consumers. And we weren't just going out there saying, hey, we want to be digitally first and personalised. There had to be a problem to solve, because without it, you're just like wasting time and money. So we were very clear around the problems we're solving for our customers by doing some work on our customer experience journeys, understanding where there was friction, etc. So I'll give you an example. So one of the biggest areas of friction in beauty is people not understanding their skin type. When they don't understand their skin type, they don't really know the right products to use. So then they go through test and learns and it fails. So one of the friction points to solve is how they can truly understand the issues with their skin. So that's what we did. We set up this incubator, and it's been incredibly successful. The way when you tap back into the formal governance structure is when you are ready to scale one of these tests. And that's the point at which we then locked in. We'd go and we went back with a business case at that point. And then we're asking for money to scale, but all the testing's done, and it's you're telling them, hey, you do this, we're going to deliver you £12 million of incremental revenue. And they're like, oh, okay, great, let's do it. And that's basically what we did. And we launched a number of experiences on the back of this.
Wonderful. So it sounds like, listening to that, Munnawar, you essentially created this kind of business on the side, or innovation hub on the side, that didn't have to go through the same governance or have the same procedures that the rest of the business, in order to build a business case to then go back and actually take the things that were validated into the core business and get them backed.
Yeah, it's exactly right. That's exactly what we did.
No, I really like it. I really admire that bravery, because I think quite often you see one of two things. You see people going, well, we can't set up an innovation hub or an incubator or whatever, your sandbox, unless we've got money, and they fall at the first hurdle and don't do it. Or the opposite happens, where you do start it and you come up with a great idea, but it's never really taken back into the core business. It always lives kind of in isolation on the side. So I like the fact that you've given a really practical kind of example to people of how they can do that in their own business without having to go and with their begging bowl, and proving that it drives value to the whole business as a whole.
Yeah, and also it is integral to what we do. When we set up our incubator, the intent wasn't to go off and create something separate. It was something that needed to work within the portfolio of brands that we had, or within the offer that we were already giving to customers. And that's where I say understanding the friction points or the problems you're solving is really important. Otherwise, you're literally just setting up a completely separate business.
Yeah,
that's
just for the sake
to do with your core, right? So for us, it was always linking back to our core. And that comes right at the beginning. You've got to be clear about why you're doing this, how it connects in with your business, and, what are the customer problems you're solving.
Great. And I guess during the last few years, with pandemic and kind of downturn, and your shift to kind of listening to consumers in different ways, the business must have changed and kind of moved into new directions. Are there any things that you've done in the last few years as a result of those, I guess, macro forces that you'll continue doing forever, and you're grateful for that kind of nudge to have done?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sure everybody's doing these things. So our approach to content and channel planning is quite different. So, I mean, this is all pre 1P data, etc. But what we now do, because we do have access to a lot of 1P data, is we build persona-driven consumer experience journeys that enables us to identify the key moments that matter, which means we're then developing the right content at the right time for the right person, which probably doesn't sound that disruptive, but for our business, we've actually only been doing that over the last sort of 4 years, I would say. For that, we had quite a traditional content and media model, is how I would describe it. So that has fundamentally shifted, and that also enables us to talk more one-on-one with customers. And if we go back to DE&I, that enables you to create authentic content in the right channels at the right time for all customers. The other thing that's quite different, and I'm not sure we've fully solved for it, is performance marketing. I remember when I started, we used to have to wait for the MMM studies to come, which was quite a wait. And then we'd be like, oh, okay, I wish we'd done X, Y, and Z differently. But the time had gone, right? It was months after. Or our brand equity tracking, that would come like a month after, all of these kind of things. Now, obviously, what's happened over the last few years is you get real-time data, which means you can make real-time pivots, which is fantastic, right? So our approach to performance marketing is great. We really move that on. What we haven't figured out, and I don't know if anybody else has, is true multi-touch attribution. Like, we're still trying to work out, what came from that influencer versus that PR versus the in-store versus, any paid media spend. I'm not sure we fully worked that out, and I'd love for us as an industry to do more work on that. So there are two things. And then kind of the other thing that's happened, which is great, is the ability to connect with customers on more than just an actual wet product. That products are much more diverse and they can be truly personalized. Like I have so many brands that I interact with that I don't just have a transactional relationship with. And I love that in the industry because we're more meaningful, right? And ultimately, that's one of the drivers that we talk about, awareness, meaning, differentiation. That we are more meaningful because we have a deeper interaction. And then the last area for me, which I absolutely love, is brands are more purpose driven. And I know that's been happening for quite a while, but I've seen more and more leaning into that, authentically leaning into it, and I've seen the difference it's making. And we do a few things, like for example, our beauty advisors work with Macmillan women with their skincare makeup when they're going through cancer treatment. Amazing. We work with the Hygiene Bank to donate products. Everybody has, access to basic bath and body products. I mean, and that makes a difference. All these things. And I know a lot of companies are out there. So I love the work as an industry that we're doing on purpose.
Great. Wow. There were some wonderful examples there, Munnawar. And what I love about some of the things that you're sharing is it feels like you have a tangible example of actually doing these things in it, whether it's purpose and the work you just described there, or I know you guys have done a lot of work around menopause and supporting women going through menopause. It's not just our purpose is written on the top of a vision house and doesn't really kind of go anywhere else. And I also like what you said about the kind of the being closer to the customer and being more meaningful. At the end of the day, a beauty brand plays a huge role in people's lives. It gives them confidence. It kind of helps them to turn up and to be the person they want to be, right? So a lot of other categories, I think, maybe struggle with how they do kind of anchor a purpose to their day-to-day marketing and comms. But I really like the tangible ways that you talk about having done these things, and you can see the business benefit from all of them, even from the examples you've given.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm sure you've seen this in all the trends work that's going on. Yeah, consumers are losing trust with big institutions, right? And so brands can fill some of that vacuum. And with trust then means we have greater responsibility to impact wider society. So one of the things I always think about when I've done the work on DE&I, and like you said, most recently I've done some work on menopause, which I can talk about, is as brands, we play quite an important role, and we can either reinforce stereotypes that are going on in the market or change the narrative and create new paradigms. So, for example, menopause, the reason I mentioned menopause has been quite a taboo subject for a lot of women. And I think Davina McCorn, a lot of other amazing women, Gabby Logan, etc., doing a huge amount of work to open up the conversation. But as a brand, and a brand that supports women with beauty products, we felt we also had a responsibility to help open up the conversation. But more than open up the conversation, we wanted to move to tangible action. So with menopause, yes, we've been out and we've done a lot of talking on it, but we've also done things like we partnered with Albright and we developed 5 free to access training modules. And they do things like, how do you have a conversation with your business or your line manager when you're going through the menopause? How do you frame the kind of support that you need? What is the menopause or perimenopause? What are the symptoms? There's a whole bunch of things out there free to access. And then we've done some work to help organisations understand what they could do to support women. So, for example, in ours, we've done training for line managers. How do you support women going through the menopause? What kind of support could you offer? How do you have a conversation where they feel comfortable, etc.? So those things create genuine change.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point that you made a second ago, that if an establishment or if an organisation that exists in the public service isn't stepping in to create those resources, then why shouldn't a brand? A brand has the connection with people. And I always remember when I used to be at Havas, we ran the Meaningful Brand Study, and the statistics that always blew my mind was that 79% of brands could disappear tomorrow and people wouldn't really kind of care because there's another brand that delivers them a similar-ish service. So I think it is really important that we remember that whilst maybe sometimes brand love can be a little bit overplayed, the role that brands do play in people's lives and how they help you solve problems and help you do what you need to do in the day-to-day of your life is actually pretty important. And you've given some really nice examples of that.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, now, well, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, so I'd like to just shift gear a little bit because you, as I say, you've given some wonderful examples, and you clearly have delivered some very successful outcomes for Number 7 from marketing. Quite often, I think when people are listening to the podcast, they're thinking, well, all the guests on the podcast are kind of so great at what they do. They probably have everything sewn up and they know exactly how to approach every conversation, which isn't always the case. So I wanted to ask you, like, what are you working on, like, as an individual? What's the thing that you're kind of trying to get better at?
Okay, so this isn't necessarily about marketing, I guess. The thing I'm trying to get better at is I personally want to see more marketeers at board level.
Yeah.
And I want us to be shaping the direction of businesses. And so the thing I'm working on is, okay, how do I get to that sort of board level? And there's a few things that I'm working on within that. One, taking on sort of broader responsibility. So, for example, I manage the gift portfolio. And the gift portfolio, though, it sounds like, well, isn't that just the pretty packaging at Christmas? Like, most of it is all about operations and supply.
Right.
And commerciality. That's what that's about. Equally, setting up and running the incubator. Yes, it's about solving customer problems, but it's really about IT, HR, business processes, all these. It's much broader than just what's our consumer proposition and what's the creative and product. And then I'm doing some non-exec roles that I do and some training with women on boards. And so I'm doing quite a bit around how can I become a much more well-rounded marketeer, so sort of more board level thinking. Because I think that's the area where sometimes marketing can in some people's opinion, marketing can be seen as, oh, it's the pretty pictures and but actually marketing is so much more than that. And I just think if we can educate, certainly for myself, I can educate myself more around, okay, what does it take to operate on a board? It enables me to have much broader commercial conversations and influence the direction. That's the kind of thing.
I love that, and I'm so glad you raised that point, because we talk about that quite a lot with our guests on this podcast, that, as you say, marketing touches so many different parts of the business, but unless marketing sits and understands other aspects of the business, as you called out, like business, commercial, ops, IT, and works out how it connects and the strategy kind of coalesces with those other departments, then often it isn't perceived in the way it should be. And I think you've demonstrated during this conversation that actually marketing not only kind of sets the stall for the purpose of the business, but it also is a growth driver. If you genuinely understand what's changing in the kind of consumer sphere, and you can then bring that insight back into the business and adapt your products, adapt your kind of processes as well as your comms, and then be agile enough to move quickly to change, then you can drive, what did you say, an additional 12 million, whatever the number is, revenue as a result of it, right? So I think that's a really nice place for us to leave the conversation, because marketing as a growth driver, as a growth engine, but also as a strategic kind of driver of the business is a super important message. But I'll leave you one last thing to share with the audience, maybe, which is, if you had one piece of advice that you'd leave the audience with when it comes to kind of marketing, what would that piece of advice be, Munnawar?
So the piece of advice for me, and I think I've already said it, is that brands play a critical role in shaping society. And like I said, we can enforce or break down stereotypes. So I'd ask people to really think about their brands, not only from a business perspective and what you're trying to do, but also from a societal perspective. And how do you want the actions that you take to be shaping wider society and culture? Because you can really make a difference in shaping the narrative. And I've definitely seen some amazing brands do that.
Well, what a wonderful place to leave the conversation now. And I think you are a great exemplar and kind of role model for doing just that and making the work that you do make a difference, not just within Number 7, but within the category and the consumer base that you touch. So thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Time for a Reset. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. We'll be back talking to a senior marketeer very soon. Make sure you don't miss out on any new episodes by subscribing on Apple, Spotify or SoundCloud, and leave us a review at timeforareset.co.uk.